Hello, very beautiful community. The tyrant in the Kremlin is about to have a very bad 9th of May World War II Victory Day parade. An embarrassing parade in which they've announced they're going to have no heavy military equipment, and they're going to accompany it by internet blockages that go further than the internet blockages they've implemented in recent weeks that have pissed a lot of Muscovites off. And there is a kind of depoliticized, almost Balladian disposition, J.G. Ballard, the novelist, that a lot of Muscovites have, which is, if I'm really struggling, let me go ahead and keep, struggling with my life, making a living, and I'm okay with these damn drones over my head as long as my internet works. And if I'm privileged, I want to go around consuming and shopping, and yes, I can have a very, 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 very low yield war zone above my head, but as long as the internet is pretty good, that's fine. Now, there is then a second depoliticized dimension here, which is how the hell did the drones get there? And for the depoliticized blob, the drones got there because Putin did something, but nobody can really know whether he had to do it or whether he did the right thing by doing it. But we do know that there are some consequences from that, and here they are. And maybe the regime could do more to mitigate these circumstances. So what's the level of agitation now in Russia, the level of agitation among the depoliticized blob relative to a couple of years ago? How do we capture it? Is it more? And the answer is yes. But how far does it go? I'd put it like this. There is no politicization of any significant segments of the Russian population into a particular political position. So there aren't people going from I'm depoliticized, I'm outside of politics, to I'm in politics and here is my position, and it's an anti-Putin position. That's not happening. But still a little bit of fatigue, agitation, which creates space for the possibility, albeit in a very depoliticized way, to express irritation with the leadership, including the top. And we already talked about one example of this viral video by Bonya, the Russian influencer, that's hit tens of millions of views and even generated a response from the Kremlin. And then she ended up debating Mr. Solovyov on his propaganda show. Now, so what there is a kind of a very partial sort of atmosphere of additional corrosiveness and dissatisfaction in the perception of the regime. It's marginal, it's small, but it's somehow moving, like sort of water that's not coming to the boil. It's sort of moved from 30 to 35 degrees, from 30 to 40 degrees centigrade. And maybe if this rolls on, but it hasn't done that yet, it could create some bubbles where a more articulate critique of the regime might be possible. At the moment, it's more inarticulate, still depoliticized, and instinctive rather than coherent, and piecemeal rather than fundamental. Nobody's questioning the legitimacy of the regime overall. But things are feeling a little bit more stale, and maybe a question or two could be asked about the leadership. Things are looking a little bit less shiny and a bit stale. And so we can ask questions like, how far is it the case that everybody there knows what they're doing, when it comes to the management of the deleterious consequences of the war and the management of the economic decline? So we're going to say more about that, but let me now turn to this myth. Now, in some ways, Russia's World War II myth is artificial because there were no parades and celebrations of the kind that they came later in the first couple of decades after the war. And the disposition on the whole was that it was a victory for the Soviet Union of a very, very, very tragic, almost existentially devastating kind. Over time, under Brezhnev, the parades infrequently appeared. And Putin, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after a decade of rule by Yeltsin, began to build that story up. He began to make it a bigger part of not just the propaganda machinery, but the narrative of legitimacy of the regime. There was somehow a continuity between his project he was claiming and this extraordinary achievement in World War II. But increasingly, as Putin escalated the militarization of this celebration, escalated the sort of mystical vagueness of it. I mean, this wasn't World War II victory being celebrated. This was some kind of a way of treating the World War II victory as a cipher onto which you can project anything you want. There was a fascicized element to it too, in the sense that it became a bit about war as an end in itself, and this famous Russian phrase, "We can repeat it if you want, so don't ask for it." There's a fascicized element to that. We can repeat our victory. We can repeat our march on Berlin. And this World War II myth is actually something that goes to the core of the legitimacy of the regimes that are going to follow Putin in Russia after Putin is gone. And you might say there are two paths for post-Putin Russia to take there. The first path is to just give up on the myth, because it's become so toxic, it's become so post-truth, it's become so fascicized, it's become so sort of, farcically linked to the misdemeanors of a criminal gang operating that narrative, that you might as well give it up. Or you rescue it. And in rescuing it, you have to actually use that myth as a vehicle to help Russia come to terms with things it's not been able to come to terms with in the past. Is that in principle possible? Sure. I mean, you can, for instance, use the World War II myth in a decolonizing way, right? By, for instance, telling stories about how it wasn't just Russia and all of these countries now that are not Russia, and that Russia should not think of as belonging to Russia in any way, were part of this. There's then a question of what's going to happen, not what Russians should do with this, but what is going to happen. And what is going to happen is that the myth cannot go away unless Russia collapses into smaller countries, which is much less of a realistic scenario than the Putin's regime's collapsing next Tuesday crowd think, but is actually a more realistic scenario than a lot of the expert community allow, in my opinion. That would be a very violent, very destructive scenario. But it's not as easily debunkable as an historical outcome as a lot of experts think. I'm afraid there's, of course, there's a big main channel video on this topic from a couple of years ago, where I roughly argue that the typical arguments you encounter in the pro-Ukrainian space for the plausibility of the breakup of Russia are largely nonsense, but that there are other considerations that aren't typically ventilated that can take us in that direction, in the direction of grasping that as a possible outcome. So if Russia persists over the next half century and a century as a state that's mostly kept its territorial integrity, I don't see the myth going away. And then for the non-politically toxic forces in Russia, the move would be to try to keep the myth, but reform it and actually use its power, use its hold over Russian culture as a way to helping Russia extract itself out of its various pathologies in its political culture. So this is an important story that goes to the core of the legitimacy of not just the Putin regime but future Russian regimes. And so it's not a completely insignificant L optically for Putin to have a very embarrassing parade. It looks weird. It looks weird because this is something he has invested so much into. And so it's very hard for Russians to look at a very emaciated parade and not feel two things. One, yeah, whatever, it's politics, it's something I don't need to work out. But two, they've said that it's a really big thing, and now they're demonstrating that they can only make it a small thing. Doesn't that potentially show that they're useless? That they've done something wrong, so there's something is not right, and so on. So it's not pretty for Putin, and Putin's very conscious of his success in having sort of tapped into the unconscious of the Russian people with this narrative, but also how there can be disturbances in that unconscious if suddenly this thing is been writing so large suddenly returns in a very reduced and awkward and embarrassing form. So a little bit of reflection on this beautiful community talk very soon. Lots of love.